Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're gathered today to discuss cooperation or competition on climate through the lens of SDG 13. My name is Kristen Cordell. I'm so happy to be with you all today. For reference, I'm a visiting fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies Project on Prosperity and Development, headed by the wonderful Dan Rundy. We're so pleased to be talking about this issue today with generous sponsorship from our friends at Chevron. I'm going to quickly introduce you to the panelists and tell you a little bit about the accompanying report that we are discussing today that will launch later this month. So first of all, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for joining. We have a really great selection of panelists today to discuss this very complex issue from a number of vantage points. We have Graham Watkins, Chief of the Climate Change Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Aparna Shrivastava, Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the International Development Finance Corporation, the USDFC, and Dr. Elizabeth Lostas, a Senior Fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental and Policy Studies at Duke University. These are wonderful panelists, and we're so pleased that they made time to join us this morning. As I mentioned, our deep look into SDG 13 and the other multilateral frameworks around climate are part of a larger research study looking across the SDGs for where the U.S. government might creatively re-engage in a number of areas to strengthen its own policy response. We'll have a study coming out to accompany this report near the end of July, and we'll be happy to share that with all of you. The study basically looks at the policy levers that SDG 13 can offer in the Biden administration's approach to climate, including climate finance and various capacity building activities. We find that 13 really offers a great opportunity for policymakers to focus on building the capacity of the local level in developing countries to respond to different climate-related issues. We find that the impact of climate change policy and capacity building that happens at the local level is one of the best tools in pushing back on impacts on the climate that may be negative. And it's a really great opportunity to build local capacity to respond directly to climate needs. So we're really looking forward to sharing that report with all of you and also hearing what our panelists have to say about the number of tools that development banks and the government, as well as civil society, have used to address climate change in developing countries. So we're really excited. So I'm going to kick it off by asking Graham to tell us about what's happening at the IDB with respect to climate-related policy. Graham, I know that you all have been working on this issue for several years now, and you have a number of best practices to share. So over to you.
So good morning, and thank you very much, Kristen. And congratulations on the study. I think it's very timely, obviously. I'm going to focus not just on SDG 13, but really on the Paris Agreement and how we're actually implementing the Paris Agreement or approaching the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and talk from an MDP perspective, obviously, with a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. And I did want to, at the outset, point out that we're still in the midst of the pandemic. So a lot of things are sort of governed to some extent by the pandemic and the ongoing impacts of the pandemic. And one of the areas that we're really looking at is how do we invest in the future? How do we plan for the future, and how do we invest and ensure a sustainable and robust recovery of the region from the impacts of the pandemic? And a lot of this is described in documents, recent documents we've published, including Vision 2025, which is the idea of how we're going to actually deliver to countries. And also our climate change action plan, which runs until 2025 as well. We have built a solid base within the IDB for moving forward with climate action, but we do need to settle that base in the context of the challenges that are occurring right now because of the pandemic. We also need to look at how can we expand resource availability, something you already mentioned, and really work much more closely, even than we have in the past, with countries. And I think those are the three big areas that I'll talk quickly about. Just on that challenges front, we do have to recognize that we've had over 1.2 million deaths in the region. We have to recognize that we've taken a huge hit to gross domestic product in the region and lost over 26 million jobs. So the situation is actually pretty dire in the region, and you only so far have just over 7% of people vaccinated. So we're a long way behind. Some countries are ahead, other countries are behind in terms of where we are. We remain committed to commitments that we did in 2016 as a bank, for example, the 30% climate finance commitment, and we're going to continue to push that. But it was affected in 2020 because the demand from the countries was very different. It was really all about health, about fiscal stability, all about liquidity, about jobs. So we have to bear that in mind as we move forward. We've also evaluated our operations in terms of how aligned they already are with Paris. About 70% are already aligned, so there's not a great deal of work to do there. 10% clearly need more information to make sure that we can actually judge that they're aligned. 15% of them would require a lot of attention in terms of resilience, adaptation, and really making sure that they fit into those broader frameworks of the Paris Agreement. And about 5% are going to require some rethinking. And those are the ones that link to fossil fuels or really require multi-sector solutions for adaptation mitigation. So that's the situation that we're in at the moment. In terms of resources to basically help countries align, there's clearly an investment gap, particularly in infrastructure. There's always an investment gap in infrastructure, but there's a particular investment gap in terms of infrastructure that is aligned with Paris. And you know, even though the big funds are now getting replenished, the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Global Environment Facility, that's not going to be enough. It's insufficient to actually drive the agenda forward. We really need to look at the MDBs as sort of almost, and I hate to say this coming from an MDB, the perfect tool for advancing the agenda, because you can take concessional finance, you can use that to leverage the ordinary capital, and then also mobilize private capital. So really direct all of that towards climate action and use those as models. I think this is the key. So we're not going to cover everything. Obviously, the MDBs don't have that kind of financing, but we can really act as guides for the way forward in terms of what you can do. And we also see that we need resources, technical assistance resources, to basically drive policy changes and regulatory support to countries, that what you were referring to in terms of capacity building, institutional capacity building, to make sure that countries can actually not just make the commitments to net zero at 2050 or commitments to adaptation, but actually turn those into real operations and real investments as we move forward. And that leads me to the sort of final point. Look, this is a country-centered agenda. The Paris Agreement is about the countries, and our role is to align our financing to help the countries move forward. And I think that that's a big shift in how we're thinking. And this means we need to help countries actually work on setting up platforms for climate action in the countries. And those range from the plans I've mentioned, long-term strategies, better NDCs, all the way through to policy regulations and business models that actually can move the agenda forward. That's a lot of change. A lot of things are going to have to move, a lot of moving parts that have to be aligned to move things in the right direction. That's a big risk too, because if they don't align, there are risks that could come. For example, this morning there was an article released coming out of China, believe it or not, about what happens if China actually reduces their demand for oil. What are the long-term implications for that for countries in terms of fiscal revenues? How do you manage those kinds of issues? So there's a lot of risks that need to be looked at beyond what we traditionally look at in terms of physical risks. And finally, we really need to think through what we call the just transition. So how do we make sure that when you're doing all of these changes, the most vulnerable are not still the most vulnerable at the end of that process? How do you be more inclusive as you move this agenda forward? How do you build the jobs for the future? And how do you change all of our systems so you're building those jobs for the future? So I'll stop there. I've probably gone over my 5 minutes, but you know, we're committed to aligning the financial flows. We've already got the strategic basis with Vision 2025, our climate change action plan. The rubber's about to start hitting the road in terms of, can we really move this agenda forward? And we really need to bring our finance and use it to actually drive transformation in countries. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that was useful.
Yes, it was very useful. And I think that commitment from the IDB is very clear with the progress that you all have made getting closer to that 30% and even exceeding it. And I'd like to ask you later about what organizational shifts have happened to get you there. But next, I'd like to go to Aparna from the DFC. We've seen a flurry of announcements from the Biden administration on climate finance. The DFC, as a new agency, really has its work cut out for it. Really curious about how you're thinking about this work and what you're prioritizing. Over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think it's helpful to have a little bit of context, as you mentioned, Kristen. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or the DFC, is America's development bank. We're the newest government agency launched in December 2019, with a mandate specifically to partner with the private sector to finance solutions, to the most critical challenges that the developing world is facing today. And as we know, climate change is one of the most urgent challenges the planet faces, and in these countries. So we currently have more than $5 billion invested in renewable energy projects around the world, and we're committed to doing more. So I'll talk through some of those commitments. But I just do want to emphasize that for this administration, one of President Biden's very first actions as president was an executive order specifically on tackling the climate crisis. So in that order, he highlighted the important role of the DFC to support developing countries in climate mitigation as part of a coordinated global effort. And so in terms of kind of the commitment to climate specifically, 3 months after that executive order was issued, there was a leaders summit hosted on climate in April, in which DFC responded with a series of pretty big commitments that are both aggressive and attainable. And so this includes kind of a range of commitments, but I'll talk through a few of the key highlights. The first being for us to achieve a net zero emissions portfolio across our portfolio, by 2040. We've also committed for 1/3 of all of our commitments to be climate linked by 2023. We've hired on, part of me being part of this climate leadership. We've hired the first ever chief climate officer, Jake Levine, and myself as the deputy chief here. We've also then launched a really exciting facility called the Climate Action Facility that's specifically allocating $50 million over the next 5 years to develop a robust pipeline of bankable climate projects, right? So I think especially with regards to adaptation, whereas we've made a lot of really great progress on the mitigation side of things, there's a lot of work still to be done with regards to building up a robust pipeline of adaptation and resilience financing projects. And so this technical assistance facility is really kind of geared towards ensuring that we can develop a robust portfolio. So as I mentioned, kind of the importance of both mitigation and adaptation are really central to how we're approaching all of this. And so maybe I can also kind of talk through in terms of these commitments we've made. We're really quite proud of them. The net zero commitment is earlier than any other G7 or G20 country, so we're really quite proud of that commitment and are committed to ensure that we can achieve it. And so in terms of how we're thinking about building a portfolio around this, we're really keen to broaden the scope of what climate finance can mean, right? I think previously, understandably, I think for a lot of the larger financing institutions, clean energy and renewable energy projects specifically have been kind of the go-to category or class of what climate finance can mean. And so when we're thinking about having 1/3 of our portfolio to be climate linked, this really spans a wide range of initiatives, so including agriculture, coastal resilience, water stewardship, and really kind of looking at this from a holistic lens of recognizing all of the impacts that the climate crisis is having, but ensuring that our portfolio is actually matching to address solutions in each of these sectors. Along with that, we're really interested in trailblazing on adaptation and resilience investments specifically, and kind of working towards mobilizing private sector capital. So ensuring that our involvement in any transaction is additional to the effect of actually crowding in private sector capital that isn't otherwise that otherwise is staying on the sidelines. So that's kind of a snapshot of where we are in terms of kind of the broader vision that we've painted and how we're intending to get there. And very, very happy to talk more as this continues.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to turn now to Dr. Lostas. She has been just so formative for this research and really taking us through a lot of what she's found at Duke on this topic. Dr. Lostas, I'd be really interested to know what your research is finding about the intersection between these policy commitments and what's happening at the local level.
Thanks, Kristen, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me to join. So my comments are really, I think, building on both Graham and Aparna's comments. And just to repeat, this is such an important moment because we have this huge crisis created by COVID in particular, exacerbating other economic issues, and a real consensus that we need to build back better, which includes addressing the climate, both from a mitigation, but also from an adaptation. And we have to continually think about at both of these levels of mitigation and adaptation. But right now, we've heard that there's been a lot of progress from the last two speakers, and it's very encouraging in many ways. The glass is half full, but also the glass is half empty. So I just want to make a couple of points, and I think coming back to your question, Kristen, my first point is we're not investing enough from the public sector. Yes, we're doing better, but not enough. And there's an important report that came out either this morning or yesterday. I just saw it this morning from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which has pointed out that yes, we are funding more in sustainable recovery funding through stimulus funding, but it is only about a third of what needs into clean energy. They're just looking at clean energy in order to meet essentially our Paris targets and what they consider the minimum. It's only a third. And if you break it down between wealthy versus less wealthy countries, you'll see that wealthy countries are at about 60%, but these poorer countries are closer to 20%. And I haven't had a chance to dig deeply into the report. It just came out, but it's definitely worth a read. And so that's really a place where the development finance community, whether multilateral or bilateral, really needs to step up. So that's point one. Number two is, even if they were to really up the game, which we hope is going to happen in the next couple of years, it's not going to be enough. We need the private sector. And there is money out there in the private sector, but just as with the stimulus money, enough of it isn't going towards those climate friendly, whether mitigation or adaptation investments. So we need more. We need to figure out ways to improve the private investments. And some of them, I think Graham kind of referred a little bit to this, is through public-private partnerships and joining in. But another place that I think that the development finance role is in something that the private sector needs but isn't going to do on their own, and that is this early stage planning, this upstream planning of identifying what are those different systems level scenarios of investments that will get us where we need to go in terms of sustainable development, climate mitigation, climate adaptation. And that is looking at, how do we invest in energy, in transportation, agriculture, et cetera, so that we get renewable energy, we get the systems that we need, water, that are able to serve our economic development, sustainable economic development needs now and in the future, especially under a changing climate scenario. And we have the tools out there. There's UNOPS, an agency of the UN, has a series of tools, lots of other agencies. So this is a place that I think is really critical for whether it's governments like the US or elsewhere, or international agencies, to really help build these, identify upstream those projects, help certify them, and provide bankable projects that will crowd in funding from the private sector. So I think that is very critical. And then the last point that I want to make is just going to throw out a new development finance tool that it's an instrument that was developed in the 80s, and I think it has its moment for being reformed but brought back, and that is debt swaps. In the 80s, the U.S. actually helped develop the debt for nature swaps, where there was a big indebtedness debt crisis going on at that point. And so some of the creditor countries essentially forgave the debt in compensation for host countries using their own currency to invest in nature projects at some discounted rate. And that was very popular, relatively popular in the 90s. They've fallen off, but there has been a little bit of talk of bringing these back, not just for nature, but also for climate. And frankly, they need to be across the all the SDGs. So projects that can be climate projects, especially climate adaptation projects, are really prime for this. And that we have a level of indebtedness right now in the low-income countries, which is ballooning, which is many places at historic rates. And so I'm happy to talk about this more, but this might be one of the interesting opportunities, particularly I'll throw out as a last thought for the two hosts of two big international environmental conferences coming up, the Conference of the Party for the Convention on Biological Diversity hosted by the by China, and then the climate talks hosted by the UK in Glasgow in October and November. And if those two countries could kind of put that up on the radar, debt for nature and debt for conservation, debt for climate swaps, that might be a great opportunities.
Thank you so much. There's a number of themes you raised I want to come back to. Maybe starting with the private sector. I think that engagement with the private sector in this space is huge. And because it's an SDG platform, a lot of private sector entities have really bought into the goals. I'm curious, Graham, from your experience working and leveraging the private sector, if you have any examples to share where this has gone particularly well. And Aparna, I'm curious how you all are thinking about the best ways to mobilize the private sector, specifically in partnership with other parts of the U.S. interagency, perhaps.
So, very quickly, I don't want to replicate a little bit what Elizabeth was saying, but I do think that the public sector actions that can support the private sector investments include this upstream work area. Building institutional capacities from ministries of finance through the sector ministries is critical. I mean, the starting point of that is the net zero commitments if you're talking about mitigation, but also adaptation commitments if you're talking about how do you build resilience into countries. And that stems all the way through planning, policy, regulatory frameworks, and getting those all aligned and getting them right. That can then lead to future private investments. I also think an area where the MDBs have been working is on the question of standards and setting up standards and clarifying standards so that for the private sector, they're not looking at 4,000 different standards out there that they're trying to focus in on. I'm going to meet these standards, not picking or cherry picking which standard they want to go with. And there has been quite a lot of advance on that, particularly in the area of sustainable infrastructure, and those sort of the movement towards things like fast infra, which is a standard for sustainable infrastructure, can help basically lead to developing taxonomies for investments in countries that can then guide those investments more effectively, private investments more effectively towards the ends that we want to see. I also think another tool that's worth mentioning is the question of sustainability-linked loans. So blending finance to reuse costs of capital because that project is aligned with those adaptation and mitigation objectives of the Paris Agreement. In terms of examples, look, I'll just roll out the classic examples from Latin America. I mean, Costa Rica really is a mover and a shaker. It's a small country, but it is developing a decarbonization plan. Well, it's got a decarbonization plan. It's moving ahead with the agenda. And just to give you some numbers, we supported the country in doing the calculations of the cost-benefit analysis. It'll bring $41 billion worth of benefits to the country, but it will also bring $19 billion worth of new investment opportunities for the private sector. And I think that's critical. We've also just finished a similar analysis of Peru. So these kinds of analysis can actually point you in the right direction in the future. Another example, Barbados. Barbados actually has a plan, the Roof to Reef program, which they've developed themselves. It's whole of government. It's coming out of the cabinet and being driven from the cabinet. And it's addressing, obviously, the critical issue of increasing storm frequencies, increasing storm intensities. But I want to come back to one of Elizabeth's comments. But there are possibilities in that for debt for nature swaps, that you can actually use that to finance those kinds of projects moving into that. And then one final example, Chile, talking about aligning private finance and ways of aligning private finance. Chile was the first country in Latin America to do a sovereign bond. That sovereign bond is aligned with sustainable infrastructure. So they went out and looked at the capital markets, the private markets, and tried to bring in financing and then drive that financing towards, again, the ends of the Paris Agreement. There are lots of these kinds of examples. But I also want to finish on Elizabeth's words. The cup is half full. We have a long way to go. We need all of the countries doing this. We don't just need our best examples. Those examples have to be transferred to across all countries to be able to move the agenda forward.
Great. Aparna?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think kind of one of the more tangible steps that we took as part of the commitments that we launched was actually putting out a call for applications to really get an understanding and kind of cast as wide of a net as possible with regards to understanding what the market looks like. So there are two calls for applications that we put out, one on distributed renewable energy and the second on climate-related investment funds. And so both of these, so the first one on the distributed renewable energy had a distinct timeline, which is closed. And we've gotten a number of applications, which we're really quite excited to be working through at the moment. And the climate-related investment funds is something that we're going to be accepting on a rolling basis. So I think that's been a really kind of helpful, tangible tool to kind of kick things off in terms of really kind of signaling to the market that this is what we're really looking to welcome. And we want to be, we likely will be issuing additional calls in the future. And I think echoing Graham's point around blended finance, I think this is a very lively, important discussion that is happening, kind of in the climate finance realm more broadly. And I think that's also reflective of conversations within the interagency, just about thinking about what, kind of what the role that DFIs can and should be playing around providing concessional capital, or whether it's in the form of subordinated debt or guarantees, first loss capital that can really kind of de-risk some of these investments in jurisdictions that are considered to be more risky for conventional investors. The other piece, I think, with regards to DFC specifically, we do offer loan guarantees and political risk insurance in jurisdictions. We also now have a new the ability to provide direct equity investments, which kind of opens the doors to further de-risking these investments for private actors. So I think with regards to kind of how we're thinking about crowding in private investment, we are kind of looking to leverage our existing suite of financial offerings that we have, but then kind of combining that with casting a wide net and figuring out how we can kind of scale the range of projects that we have relating to climate. I think, and if helpful, I'm kind of happy to talk through some of those examples with regards to, kind of for example, the Kipeto wind project in Kenya. That's, where we supported the construction of a 100 megawatts renewable facility. That's a great example. We also have, smaller distributed renewable energy projects, a really interesting project in the Philippines looking at food security. So I think, we actually do have quite a good track record of investing in climate related projects already. And I think the key question right now is how can we do that at even a larger scale?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think thank you so much for flagging those call for proposals. I think making sure that those have a wide remit is really important. And maybe that's something that we can also follow up and share with everyone listening to the call so that they're sure that they have the opportunity to submit calls for interest, because I found in my time at USAID that co-creation element can be really powerful. And the earlier the cooperation begins, the more likely that the project and opportunity will be co-created and co-visioned. Elizabeth, the issue of standards has come up. I know we've talked a lot about standards, and specifically your effort to look across different standard setting bodies when it comes to infrastructure. And I know that's very closely linked to climate. We've talked a little bit as well about potentially how Blue Dot Network can play in this space. I'm curious if you can give us an overview of what you've been finding on standards and the way in which policymakers can sort of consolidate and apply those standards in areas where climate and infrastructure meet.
Sure. And this is really building on the comments that Graham started in his last comments. So in particular around sustainable infrastructure, there is a huge agreement that we should be building sustainable infrastructure. And in fact, we have the tools and the models to do that. But a big problem is we almost have too many tools and too many standards and too much unharmonized, non-harmonized information out there so that it's confusing. And say a bank that wants to make a loan has said you need to only fund sustainable infrastructure, to which they might agree but have no idea actually how to make that call. And, climate emissions may be amongst the easiest piece of that. But if you look more broadly over sustainable infrastructure, it's very complicated. And so there have been a series of efforts, and these are also related to some of the audience might think of them as ESG funding with ESG projects, which stands for Environment, Social Governance, ESG. So there have been a number of efforts to begin to try and come up with rating standards or certification or various ways of identifying what infrastructure is sustainable. But one of the efforts that Graham mentioned is called Fast Infra, and that is trying to bring together mostly the banking sector, both the World Bank and IMF, I think, have been leading this, but with HSBC and several other private sector banks, and bringing in a lot of different of the regional development banks, et cetera, and trying to say, okay, let's all try and agree on what those standards are for the finance end, called Fast Infra. Well, they're and that's in the process, and they're sort of beta testing it, and that may end up being a very helpful tool for the financing end, being able to essentially slap something on and saying this is certified with Fast Infra under blank, blank, blank. But there is another process, which I think, Kristen, you're talking about, that is going on a little bit more at a political level, and that is something called the Blue Dot Network, which is, I know the Development Finance Corporation is keeping close tabs on this. The State Department of the US is involved, as is the government of Australia and the government of Japan. And this comes out of the G20 process. They have something called quality infrastructure, and they're trying to come up with a standard, kind of like a good housekeeping stamp of approval certification. You could get 1 dot, 2 dots, or 3 dots, and it would provide sustainable infrastructure. So how does this compare with something like Fast Infra? Well, they're kind of trying to do the same thing. And so one concern is that this might just be creating more noise. But and these are all still at early stages of development. The Blue Dot Network is still quite early, but it has the support really of, at the government level, of governments across the globe. It is, this is now my personal comment, this is not official, but it appears that it is essentially made to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative and try and not only help governments, but also crowd in private sector funding once they see this blue dot in order to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, although formally that is not the case. China is not involved, is not one of the many, many countries involved in Blue Dot Network. I could get into more details. I'm guessing I've already probably gone too far, but I want to bring this back to the title of the this panel, which is Compete or Cooperate. I think this is really a point with China and really much of the Western world, not the Western world, because the Quad, the US and India and Japan and Australia are all behind this blue dot. India has been invited in, plus the EU, plus South Korea are all interested in this blue dot. China has its own plans and systems through the Belt and Road Initiative. They have something called the traffic light. This could be a place where everybody gets together and agrees on standards which will raise the boat for everyone, or it could become a competition between the two. But either, if it's successful, it will help hopefully raise all of the investments by providing these standards.
Thanks for that very helpful overview. I think this space is incredibly interesting because the standards that are being set will have long-term impact in the developing world and also really harmonize accountability across donors, or as you said so eloquently, potentially bifurcate them. I wonder if Graham or Aparna wants to add anything here before we move on to the standards conversation. I wanted to ask both of you about operational changes. We've talked about the strategy, we've talked about the policy. I want to talk a little bit about the operations. And one reason why is I think IDB and its partners are really far out. And I think that there's several best practices the USG could really learn from and benefit from, although they're at more nascent stages, which is totally fine. Graham, we talked a lot about, having institutional converts in different parts of the organization. Can you tell us a little bit about where you've concentrated your efforts to make sure that this is a way of doing business as opposed to a one-off objective?
Well, I think actually at the beginning, Aparna made a cross comment about the focus of climate action being only really on energy initially, if you start, as you move into the concept basically of Paris alignment. But I think we've evolved well beyond that. I think we did the same thing. We started with renewable energy as the entry point. That has moved to the point, firstly, of expanding to all infrastructure sectors. And so today, when we talk about climate action, we're talking about energy as an obvious one, but transport now, because you need to be looking not only at mass transit systems, but also at electromobility. You also need to be looking at the resilience of these systems, which can mean looking at resilience at a broad scale, at a network scale, but also looking at resilience directly in a road. What kinds of culverts does it need, and what should be the design standards? Returning back to the discussion on standards. Water and sanitation is critical from an adaptation and resilience perspective. And as Aparna mentioned at the beginning, digitalization is a new area of infrastructure where the jury is sort of out a little bit, because one consequence of digitalization is increasing productivity, which can also increase emissions. Another one is reducing emissions because you're not having to travel so much. But you need to balance those and look at those. But digitalization could be an important way forward in terms of reducing emissions over time. So there's a lot of infrastructure-related activities. One area in particular of infrastructure that we've really pushed forward with is sort of green buildings. Again, this refers back to having standards on this, on emissions and on resilience of green buildings. But there are emerging sectors where climate action is equally important. And I'll just give you an example. In Haiti, we approved a project a couple of weeks ago where we looked at the possibility of creating social protection systems by having cash transfers to vulnerable communities that are massively affected by natural disasters. Creating those kinds of resilience mechanisms and linking them into social protection systems is key for the future. And this is an area which we're beginning to look at, beginning to work on. I already mentioned the question of the just transition, but to do a just transition, it means you have to change how your schools work. You have to change how your education system works. How do you build skills? How do you build skills for the new future? We analyzed with ILO what are the implications of decarbonizing Latin America and the Caribbean, and found that 15 million net jobs would be created. But there's a lot of job shifting going on. And when you do that job shifting, who's going to be doing the training that allows somebody to rapidly move from an old job to a new job? So there's a whole area of work there. There are also, for Latin America and the Caribbean, a huge set of issues that are directly related to migration. But increasingly, migration is getting pushed by natural disasters, by the fact that there are some places where you can't live anymore. You're going to have to move around. So these are all new areas that need to be looked at. But I also think that one of the lessons learned from previous transformations is that if you don't build the basis for this going forward, if you don't build this into your systems, then it will not be successful. It'll be sort of a flash in the pan, and yeah, everybody will invest today, and it'll be a fad, and then they go back to the future. That requires you to change policy, fundamental policies. One of the biggest challenges, for example, from a natural capital perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, is subsidies. You have to remove harmful subsidies. Subsidies is a big issue for fossil fuels. You need to start thinking about removing these subsidies and replacing them with green taxes, with taxes which are actually moving in the right direction. So there's a whole area of policy change that needs to be looked at, and governments need support with that. We need to be working closely with governments to help them look at what makes most sense, what's going to work, what's not going to work. And then I want to end by saying, well, the MDBs have a role of bringing in finance. So yes, you can have concessional finance, you can blend it, and you can draw in private investment. But again, the MDBs don't have enough money to fill the gap that is required to be filled. You need to change the systems in countries, the financial systems in countries. And this is why I mentioned Chile as an example. That's one way of changing financial systems, is to actually, the financial systems start driving the capital market resources towards the goals and ends of the Paris Agreement. That's one way. The other one, and this again has been an executive order actually from in the US, is the question of risk. How do you address transition risks and physical risk? And how do you work with countries so that they're incorporating that into the public sector finance, into the mechanisms that they're using to finance things? How do you make sure that all operations are resilient? But probably more deeply, how do you create adaptation plans and finance those adaptation plans so you're actually creating more resilient futures for countries? So I think that in a broad sense is the directions we can go. And I could go into a lot more detail of exactly what we did within the organization to get to that point. But hopefully that gives you a taste about what we're moving with.
Yes, very helpful. Aparna, can I ask you to pick up on this theme of resilience and risk? I know we've talked about DFC widening the aperture on the resilience conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it actually very much ties with what Graham was saying around, I think there's a range of organizational shifts that are required if we're wanting to prioritize adaptation and resilience investments. So I think, kind of with resilience, for example, there's a few, for example, we're quite involved with the Adaptation and Resilience Collaborative that was launched kind of as part of the G7, being led by FCDO in the UK, and kind of has several DFI actors as part, really kind of thinking through, kind of different working groups around investment vehicles and approaches specifically to adaptation and resilience, how to assess physical climate risks, specifically, again, relating to resilience, and how that can be translated into, the credit risk ratings and the financial screenings that happen. But then also looking at harmonized metrics, right? So investor-ready metrics that relate to both adaptation and resilience. And I think for all of this, there's been some really great progress, I think, in the broader ecosystem of climate finance, right? So if we look to what the EU has launched with the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, there are some really good resources that are out there that are moving in the right direction. But how that reflects internally in organizations, I think is a question that's being grappled with kind of on a contextualized basis for every organization, right? I think, and when we look at DFC specifically, we have a really robust screening process in place with regards to any project in our pipeline that has to go through, kind of very rigorous analysis from environment, social, governance, our commitment to 2X with regards to gender equity, but then also our the financial analysis, right? And so looking at the actual credit rating of potential projects and the credit risk associated with any transaction. And so to think about how we can integrate climate as part of that screening process is very much an active discussion right now. I think not only for DFC, but really across the interagency. We are in close conversation with colleagues at USAID, at MCC, and with several other actors within the government to really think about critically and credibly how we can make sure that we're achieving these targets and ensuring that our internal processes, kind of all the way from how we're casting that wide net to attract these projects to actually being able to get some of these deals over the line to be able to disperse funds at every step of the way. How can we actually be asking the right questions, whether it's kind of at that very initial stage with the potential clients, all the way through conversations with the board and other important stakeholders. So I think it's a really active discussion. I think there's a lot of important considerations around any investments that we're making to think about credible alternatives and the important considerations around all of that. So I'll pause there.
Yes, Elizabeth, please.
I just want to add a little note to what Aparna just said, which is a bit tangential to today's topic, but interestingly, what Aparna just talked about at DFC and USAID, and also with help from the State Department on resilience and trying to incorporate that into financing is really leading the US government. What we're not doing is necessarily putting that same attention to our efforts at home domestically. And I know that's not our discussion today, but it's really this outward lending is much further, more thoughtful than what we're doing in our climate financing and climate efforts at home, where it's much more focused on the emissions and mitigation. So just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Some of our analysis of SDG 13, found that in reporting on their own domestic progress, the SDGs actually provide this really great vehicle through voluntary national reviews to give updates on where they are domestically, and really recommending that the administration potentially take advantage of that type of domestic reporting to show that not only are we bought into the framework abroad, but also when applied to our own context. I want to ask each of the panelists to reflect on a final question. It's clear that the new administration really wants to take a multilateral approach to this and many other issues, which we find in our research is a great step forward in utilizing international institutions in this work. What does success in that look like? If you were to say the defining characteristic of in multilateral engagement for the sake of climate change, where would you focus your efforts? And I'd like to start with Elizabeth. We'll go backwards, Elizabeth, and Aparna and Graham.
All right. Well, what jumps to mind immediately is so much of the energies of the U.S. government right now is focused on our relationship with China, which is complicated, as we all know, and multi-tiered. And I would say success would be one, figuring out a way to the best success would be if one could actually collaborate in this climate sphere, both with our own domestic efforts, but also overseas investments, lending grants. And we could essentially put aside other issues or maybe even improve our relations elsewhere because we could do something positive. But short of that, assuming that is just too much, I would say having a healthy rivalry where we agree to compete on this and do our own thing, but in a constructive way would still be a real win with China. And that's hopefully the U.S. having aligned itself with the EU and Japan and Australia and South Korea, and hopefully many of the folks in the lower income, middle and lower income countries.
Sort of a race to the top.
Yes,
Elizabeth has
exactly.
an article on this very issue, which I commend to all of you. Really excellent, breaks down opportunities for cooperation. Aparna?
Thanks. And what a great question to end this on. I think I'll take a little bit of liberty in how I answer that, because I think success, I think especially coming into this role just a few months ago at the DFC, I've thought about this quite a bit, right, in terms of what can success look like for the integration of climate in such a critical institution of the U.S. government. And I think in terms of how I think about success for our agency, and I think especially kind of outlining in kind of on the heels of what Elizabeth has just outlined, I think there's ultimately for me, I think it all comes down to the deals that we do, right? 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 7 years from now, kind of looking back at this time and thinking about, you know, kind of we're in this really critical window with regards to the climate crisis more broadly, of course, but we're also in a really critical window of how we're signaling to the broader markets of what the multilateral community, what the DFI community is really looking to commit itself to and put our money where our commitments are, right? And so I think success for me in that, say, 7 years from now, looking back at this period, would be really looking at how cutting edge of a portfolio, how diversified of a portfolio have we been able to build and actually invest in that really demonstrates our commitment to climate leadership, right? And climate action, both on the fronts of mitigation and also adaptation and resilience, right? And so I think really kind of looking at this from very much of a transaction basis and really thinking about, okay, what does a robust cutting edge climate portfolio look like, and how can we actually work towards investing in that and actually having a deal flow to reflect that.
That's very helpful, thanks. And it's so great to see you in this role. Graham?
So I probably go a little bit broader. I do think, and I repeat this message, that the first multilateral arrangement needs to be to deal with the pandemic now and solve the problems of the pandemic, because I repeat, Latin America and the Caribbean is still in the midst of this sort of almost an epicenter-wise. And we need to drive sustainable recovery as we move forward. I also think that the measures of success are somewhat defined in the Paris Agreement. So 1.5 degrees and adapted countries, basically, at the end of the day. And to get to that point, just running quickly through many of the issues we've already discussed, we really need to build the institutional, have built, to do it as a measure of success, the institutional capacities of ministries of finance and sector ministries for decarbonization, ensuring resilience and adaptation. This means that the country policies, the planning, the regulations, the legislation, and the business models need to be all aligned with this agenda at the end of the day. That to me is measurable, and it is the key measure of success. That's the country-driven approach. To do that, I think you have to address political economy challenges, real ones, and really very difficult ones. We're shifting a mindset from a fossil fuel-dominated world to basically a renewable-dominated world. That shift is going to happen. It's already happening, but we need to manage it. And it's happening because it's cheaper to do renewable energies. I mean, it's not necessarily happening because of political will. It's actually happening because the money will flow to where it needs to flow. But there's going to be winners and losers, and those need to be managed effectively. Otherwise, you're going to get disruptions of the systems. And there are massive implications for jobs, industries, changes that will occur. Even if you look at the electromobility changes that are happening today, by 2025, electric cars are going to be cheaper than combustion engine cars. What does that mean, and how are we going to manage that? Those issues would have been managed. And then I think that there are areas of added complexity that we're beginning to see. We're only now beginning, for example, to look at the question of what are the transition risks for countries, and how is that going to affect a country in the future? How is physical risk going to affect the country's ability to borrow? We need to have ways of dealing with those kinds of challenges. We can see them coming down the line. How are we going to deal with those today? Because in 5 years' time, they're going to be real challenges and real problems. And ultimately, the hope would be, and the future vision would be, that we have a much better world that's much more inclusive, that really is built around renewable energy and not built around fossil fuels. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Graham. And I think that's a really important and poignant reminder of the current pandemic crisis we're still facing, and many countries really in the midst of that right now, and recovery will be quite long. This week, the high-level panel is meeting in New York to reflect on the SDG adaptation to the COVID response and to a just recovery. And I think it's a really important reminder as we wrap up. I'd like to thank our panelists this morning so much. Really bright and really innovative contributions to this debate, and thank them for helping us along the way with our report as well. Graham, Aparna, and Elizabeth, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank CSIS, Project on Prosperity and Development, and our very generous sponsorship from Chevron. We look forward to sharing the report with all of you when it's out later this month, and we really appreciate you joining for this conversation. I'm sure there will be many more to follow. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day.